This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm David Blaney. An innovative idea can change the world, but to turn an idea into a viable product, you need money. It's therefore crucial for universities to do a good job connecting their innovators with investors who can provide the capital necessary to turn those ideas into reality. Programs like Perth's West Tech Fest aim to bring investors and innovators together. I'm joined by two of the founders of West Tech Fest, the Director of Commercialisation at Curtin University, Rohan McDougall, and all the way from Silicon Valley, venture capitalist Bill Tai, who's also an adjunct professor of innovation at Curtin University. Thank you very much for coming in, Rohan and Bill.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So, Bill, you've been a venture capitalist for nearly 30 years. In that time, there's a handful of companies that you haven't been on the board of. And you've also helped out quite a few Perth entrepreneurs get their ideas off the ground. In the West Australian, you're quoted as saying that Perth could soon become the new Silicon Valley. How so?
You know, I have to say that when I first came to Perth and I got off the plane and hit the water here, I had this, of course, wonderful moment standing at the beach, and I thought to myself, I'll bet this is what California was like decades ago, except instead of California's gray water, the water here is blue. The sand is not brown, but it's white, and the air temperature is about 10 degrees warmer. And I thought, what a wonderful place to live. And on the way to the beach, of course, on the roads, I thought, wow, the infrastructure here is great. Whether it's roads, telecommunications, the rule of law is fantastic. This is the kind of foundation you need to attract the workers that you need today to build the kinds of companies that we have that are basically moving bits around.
Bill, Silicon Valley is, I guess, synonymous with innovation and tech and cool people wearing T-shirts and offices and all kinds of cool stuff. Is that perception changing? Are we seeing new Silicon Valleys pop up?
Absolutely, yes. I think, so of course the word Silicon Valley the phrase Silicon Valley has the word silicon in it. And I think there was a time when I think it was really only possible to be competitive in the technology of the day, at the time silicon, if you were in Silicon Valley, because the products and the process technologies to make the products in that era weren't a kid in a dorm room. They were teams of people that might number in the hundreds that were specially trained in certain areas like semiconductor physics, and you had to collect them in one place because the communications technologies that we have today didn't exist then. And so in that era, Silicon Valley was the dominant and only place. It was like the stock markets of, people's stock markets that had network effects, because the people that understood those technologies that wanted to work on them, they got up and moved to Silicon Valley. So all the talent was in one place. And I think as we move from the core of the networks and the little things that move the atoms around to the edge of the networks and the user interface, and it's the next generation and the kids that use that stuff, the companies that build the applications on top of the technology stack, those can be anywhere, and they can be customized to local languages where Western folks may not have the language or customs, the behavioral understanding of the markets in China or Indonesia or Japan. So you're seeing now at the edge a cultural fragmentation and creation of giants that map different societies and cultures because they understand how people do things. And so I think as technology continues to progress, you're going to see the spreading of that and the ability to build companies that are scalable from anywhere. It is easier to scale certain kinds of companies in Silicon Valley because you literally have, 1 million people in the valley that have built Yahoo and Google and Facebook, and they hop around from place to place and they hop on the next wave to add value. But what we're seeing now is that it's clearly more and more possible to build leaders in their categories that start in places like Perth, like Canva did. It's possible.
Yeah, I think the term Silicon Valley can be overdone in government settings. Is often agendas about we want to create the next Silicon Valley here or there, or Silicon Valley has a particular set of characteristics that enabled its establishment. Some major investment from the Department of Defence and establishment of a couple of companies, some great universities that spurned the tech industry that's around there. I think other regions probably have to look to what benefits they have and what base they have to grow industries and new markets. And I think, as I said earlier, we do have some big companies that are based here and have really the need to invest locally. We should use those as a base and look at some of the technologies that they need, like autonomous operations, like remote operations, like robotics and artificial intelligence, and use that as a base to grow.
And Bill, would you care to elaborate on what you mean by timing?
Yeah, I think, of course, markets form at, there's a kind of a sequential building of technology waves on top of prior waves. And of course, there are many different industries, but the one I deal in, it was really founded around moving electrons around, the silicon wave. And then on top of the creation of silicon chips, products like routers and switches and hubs and communications gear were built out of those little Lego blocks, and then internet networks were built off of those boxes. And then I think we've moved recently into a newer wave of user interfaces on top of that network, and the data science that is involved in trying to figure out growth, revenue, engagement of different products. And depending on what you want to build, you need to be kind of at the right place at the right time. Building something from prior wave, if you wanted to start a silicon company right now, it's pretty hard. It's possible to get traction around one particular little product, but to try to build a foundational company, very difficult and very expensive, because there's a lot of competitors in the market. And I think what we've seen in the newer era is when there was a shift from things that moved atoms to things that moved bits, it enabled kids in dorm rooms to create the foundations of monsters, like a Mark Zuckerberg in his dorm room at Harvard. And so I think as people think about what they want to do, you want to be paddling on your little surfboard on a wave that's coming, not trying to swim up the back of one that's already done with giants on it.
And that's why, for example, Facebook has succeeded, Google Plus didn't quite.
I think a head start makes a ton of difference in technology, because things change really fast, and the ability, particularly in a market like that where there are network effects, because if you think about Facebook as a sort of a stock market of people, so to speak, if you think about a securities exchange where you're buying or selling a share of say a big company like IBM, once thousands and thousands or maybe millions of buyers and sellers of a share of IBM coming to one place establish that as the place, the New York Stock Exchange, for example, it's pretty hard for somebody trying to make a market in IBM at the ASX to get traction, because everybody else is where everyone else is. And so I think once Facebook got going, because marketplaces have network effects, they build a barrier that's a natural barrier that's really hard to break. I mean, Google had that benefit as well in the ad marketplace, where they had just so much traffic that the rates that they could offer to sellers and buyers were better than everyone else's.
You could also be too early, though, because if you think about MySpace, for example, that perhaps they were too early, people weren't as inclined to enter or to use devices, or they weren't as accessible to have the content and photos and information that you could share with your peers. So people used it, but just not at the same scale.
True. Well, and I think, Google wasn't the first search engine.
There was Alta Vista, there was Yahoo, I think, as well.
Yeah, there were several. I think Google might have been the seventh major search engine. I mean, there are many other attempts to become, prominent, but from other companies. But the big ones were, whether you mentioned, Alta Vista or Yahoo or Ink2Me or Overture, or there were a lot of them. Netscape and Excite had a partnership too, and Google just had a slightly more efficient way of categorizing and indexing the pages. And they weren't the earliest, but they were still relatively early on the wave as the wave was still building. It's just a lot easier to get your share of a market when the market is growing and expanding versus already mature and you're fighting it out with well-formed companies.
Can you think of any innovations which are around now or which have been around? You mentioned MySpace, which perhaps were a little bit or are a little bit ahead of their time. Perhaps we're not quite ready for them yet.
Well, I think the whole cryptocurrency blockchain space is it's a really interesting technology that does, I think, have a lot of applications that are going to be useful, but it's still a little bit on the early side in terms of commercial acceptance and traction.
No.
Well, look, I'd concur with Bill. That seems to be the area there. A lot of people are playing with where is the application for that fundamental technology, and I think people are casting the net pretty far and wide. You hear in some of the programs we run at Curtin, people have a blockchain for everything, and I don't think blockchain is the answer to everything. So it's going to filter down to a couple of core applications where the fundamental features of blockchain really align very well with the business model, and I think we'll see some successful companies arise from that.
Rohan, it's your job to take an idea out of the journal article, out of the laboratory and into the real world. How does commercialisation work in the university sector, and why is it so important?
Well, most of the things that we see from a commercial perspective are quite early, so they may have had some proof of principle in an academic or research model, but they haven't really gone through the rigorous and robust sort of testing required for release into the wild or release onto the public, as it might be. So what we do is take what's being developed and then put it in front of industry and investors and try and get advice of what's required to take it to the next stage, to get it into the marketplace, and what hurdles might there be, what regulatory steps might need to be taken, what sort of scale up is required. And we look at trying to take it through a stepwise process of undertaking that pilot trialling, prototyping, proof of concept, regulatory approval, partnership with industry, to get it to a point where it's ready to be released into a product or service. It can take quite a long time, as it's 5 to 10 years from where a research idea may have been generated to getting it into a product or service that can be used by the community.
And how are our universities going with respect to commercialisation?
Well, there's probably a general consensus that we could be better at it, that there should be more industry and university collaboration. Australia doesn't rank well in innovation types of rankings, but they have a whole range of different measures that look at the amount of patents filed, the numbers of collaborations with industry, the co-publications with industry, the co-applicants with industry on patent applications, for example. And we don't perform as well as some jurisdictions on some of those measures. But as I said, it is a long-term process. It does require companies with vision to take a significant amount of risk to go early on next generation products and services. And I think one of the things Bill often says is you've got to have the right timing to be successful in the commercial market. And often a lot of the research that it's undertaken at universities is pre the stage that the market's at, and so maybe a little bit early on the cycle, and it needs other sorts of infrastructure to catch up, perhaps, so that some of these new innovations can be implemented.
We hear a lot about the innovation economy, usually in annoying and ubiquitous government ad campaigns, but a report from Harvard University recently ranked Australia 93rd in the world for economic complexity, which is essentially how sophisticated our exports are. Rohan, we mainly export rocks. What problems does this pose, and how can we improve this?
When I moved to Perth, I probably had a similar view that I thought that it was a relatively unsophisticated industry base, the mining industry and oil and gas industry. And my previous career had been in biotechnology, and I was a little bit despondent about the level of activity in that market in Western Australia. But I think I've changed my view on that the mining industry is a big driver and adopter of technology. If you think about the autonomous operations and remote operations and robotics and artificial intelligence that's being applied to these companies, which are essentially just big logistics businesses. They move stuff from place to place and make sure that it meets customer requirements. There's a lot of technology that goes into that process, and I think the advantage for somewhere like WA is that we have massive customers who are interested in that sort of technology, and we can use them as lighthouse customers for new developments in a whole range of different technology areas. And that's a focus of a lot of the sort of activity that we have here is use what you have. You can't necessarily change some of the fundamentals about a place like Perth, and we do have a lot of advantages. So that's, I think, the benefit that we have.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I think if you think about the wave that we're on now, a lot of it has to do with AI and data science and things like that. And the logistics component of all of these massive companies exporting rocks and other things, those present an amazing opportunity for the modern data companies to apply their skills to optimize and make those things more efficient. And by the way, there are also there are a lot of rocks, but there are also some interesting new companies. If you think about what's happened with Atlassian or GitHub or the emergence of a company like Canva, there are quite a few interesting companies that are making an impact at a global level.
GitHub's an Australian company.
Started with a couple of Australian guys. Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah. Microsoft bought it for $7 billion, I think.
I think the thing that you've often said, Bill, is that it's changed from the wave that you talked about is that the low capital requirement for getting some of these businesses started means that you can start them anywhere, really. It's the idea and the code required to get some of these businesses up and running is not onerous and can be done by a couple of individuals and only a few $100,000. It's when you start getting to scale that you need to think about where you might co-locate or set up a different establishment so you can build the engineering base to really get to the significant market level.
Do you think there's a risk of companies being perhaps overcapitalised? We've had WeWork, for example, that turned into a bit of a calamity, and that was adored by investors in the US.
Yeah, I think we're in a short-term aberrant market, I think, in terms of a capital market. And,
don't say the B word.
There's always a bubble somewhere, and the bubbles move around. And I think where we are today, just one person's opinion, I think we have, because of the interest rate environment and the push for growth and the effectively the printing of money by so many governments, as that money tries to find a place to stimulate, either spending or what have you to drive economic growth, it's pretty hard for that capital to find a home. So it's working its way into the capital markets, inflating asset prices. And with interest rates where they are, when you look at the choices, if you're trying to put capital at scale out there to earn a return, pretty hard to get a big number on bonds at negative rates in some cases. And
your bank account's going to be getting, that's not even going to keep up with inflation either.
Sure. Well, and there are some bank accounts, like some countries have bank accounts where if you have over a certain amount, they apply a negative interest rate. So they take a little bit of away every year just for saying thank you for putting all your money here, And so I think, it's hard to put it in cash, it's hard to put it in bonds, and stock prices in terms of a multiple of earnings are at levels this world hasn't seen before. So with those markets kind of fully priced, a lot of the money is trying to find its way into private equity and late stage venture capital, seed capital a little bit too, but it's very hard to put a lot of money into seed projects. So the late stage companies that have momentum are able to attract capital up until last month. I think these companies with a lot of momentum have been able to attract a lot of capital on the thesis that if they have network effects or can become sort of natural monopolies, that capital is a weapon. And if you can force that thing to grow to become the leader in its category, by definition, if it's a big category, you're going to have a big outcome. And I think that's kind of what SoftBank, I think, was thinking as they put money into the Ubers and into the WeWorks and things like that. And, it's not an irrational idea, but I think it presumes that companies are like machines, and they're not really. Companies are basically made of a bunch of people that have, I think, subjective views on what they want to do with capital. And I think a lot of capital injected into a company takes away their discipline. And it might lead to cultures that just are not able to earn a profit. And I think that is part of the issue. The losses that come with a lot of capital have made investors in the public markets, after the high value private markets, shy away from the companies and the valuations, because they look at the trajectory of cash on hand versus cash burned every month, and they say, oh, well, this is going to need another financing pretty soon, and it's going to do with my shareholding. So it's making these prices in the public markets less than the private valuations. And with that correction around WeWork and a few others like Uber and some of the big giants that people had high hopes for, I think an adjustment is starting to occur in the late stage private markets.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting, because I think I remember asking you in 2009 when you came out about the bubble then, because there was companies like Twitter and Facebook that were going to IPO, and they had these massive valuations and no profitability, and it just seemed crazy at the time, but they've steamed on since then. And it's really about the ability to lend money and bet on these companies is banking on the future. And if you're positive about the future, you continue to put money in, and you continue to be able to borrow. If something happens that changes your confidence in the future, the whole thing kind of shifts.
Yeah.
So, Bill, you're quite heavily involved with the blockchain and the cryptocurrency sector. Pretty much every man and his dog has their own fork of Bitcoin these days. Do you see cryptocurrency replacing or sort of augmenting traditional currency anytime in the future?
I guess it's when you say any time in the future, that is quite a long horizon.
Yes.
I think it's not going to happen in the next few years. I think over a longer term, which I don't know if that's 10 or 20 years, but I think it's probably in that range. Do I think that most currencies will be digital? I think absolutely the case. I think, will they be accounted for or ledgered by things that look like blockchains? I think there's a very high probability that they will be, because it's a lower cost way to handle the accounting part of keeping track of those things. Do I think there'll be wildly open worldwide currencies that no one manages or no one sort of governs? I don't know. I think that one's going to be a harder one, because I see a lot of countries at this point in time working on their own digital versions of their own fiat currencies, and a little bit of a lot of institutional resistance, of course, to things that threaten government's ability to control the flow of monetary units in their economy. So I think as long as the governments are not really comfortable with it, there's going to be a significant part of the population that isn't going to want to go there. So I don't see it happening like very soon, But I think the long term, the application of the technology, absolutely. The existence of worldwide universal currencies, they will also always exist, but it'll be a question of how broadly they're used.
Rohan, West Tech Fest is going to see teams of entrepreneurs pitching their ideas. Has anything caught your eye so far?
Well, this year we've changed the format slightly, and there will be a pitching session sponsored by the US State Department, the local Perth consulate, on Rotto tomorrow. And they're companies that are aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is part of the work that Bill's been doing on shifting global competition. He's been involved in Extreme Tech Challenge towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a couple of companies in that I think are interesting. So there's one technology out of Curtin, which is a future thermal battery technology. So one of the limitations on use of renewables on the grid, large scale, is being able to store energy when it's being produced during the day and used in peak periods. And some of the inhibitors to large scale battery use are the cost of doing it at scale. And this team at Curtin's come up with a low-cost material that can be used on a large scale to manage renewable energy generation at grid level. There's another one, a smaller business that's looking at called Climate Clever, which is looking at educating people about climate management and schools in particular so it enables schools to manage their own power and electricity and energy use, but at the same time teach kids about more effective energy use. So that's an interesting one too. That's from Curtin adjunct Vanessa Rowland.
And Bill, have you noticed anything?
In terms of
I don't think Bill's seen them yet.
yeah, I haven't. I've not seen them yet, but the general discussion about a shift towards companies that have an element of sustainability. That I think is a very important thing for this world today, because I think of course, in my opinion, you have the newer companies represent the future of where this world is going in terms of both productive economy and the way things, the customs by which people handle the use of natural resources and the output and the byproduct. And you think back to the glamour and glory of the creation of plastic. And I don't know how many of you in the listening audience have seen the movie The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman. But it's a quite a famous film, I think from the 50s, where the Dustin Hoffman character is a young graduate from university, and he's trying to figure out what to do in life. And he's kind of hanging around with this family. There's some other color to that, which people that watch The Graduate, they'll understand. And the man of the house puts his arm around young Dustin Hoffman and says, one word, meaning the future. One word, plastics. And if you think about, you remember all the cartoons and things from the 50s, 60s that you might have seen little clips of. Plastic was seen as this thing that was just amazing and totally positively changing the world. And, even Disney had, I think it was Disney or Epcot Center had little displays of whole houses made everything of plastic, and because it was this new science fiction-like material that was cheap and durable, it would last forever. And it was kind of like the future of the world was going to be built with these things. Man could conquer molecules and make things that were wonderful. And 40, 50 years later, that shit's around in the ocean. A sperm whale just washed up on the beach somewhere. I saw a headline that they cut it open. There were 100 kilograms of plastic in it? And so nature has not evolved. Nature takes a long time to evolve. The Darwin theories, they seem to work, but they don't happen in, a couple of years unless they're insects that are breeding, with short cycles. But, I think the challenge that the world's environment has to ingest the things that man has made, it's a big problem. And finally, I think the last 3 years, the awareness of issues like this, not just plastics, but carbon, people have been concerned with carbon for the last 20 or 30 years, but I think all of these things are coming to the forefront now. And I think technology is one of those things that can be used to solve problems at scale. And to the extent that entrepreneurs today can do things and apply their energy and talents to fix the issues that we have created for ourselves for the last 100 years, it's time. We have to do that.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Bill and Rohan, for coming in and sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about anything we've covered in this episode, please get in touch by following the links in the show notes. Bye for now.